Welcome, dear listeners, to another bone-chilling episode of our scary stories. I'm your host, and tonight we venture into the heartland of America, where golden fields of corn sway gently in the wind by day, but hold unspeakable horrors by night. Grab a warm blanket, dim the lights, and gather round as we delve into a tale that explores the darkness hidden within the fabric of small-town life. A tale where tradition, belief, and the dire cost of skepticism intertwine. Tonight, we present to you The Dark Harvest. Sarah's old car rumbled down the narrow road, flanked by towering trees that formed a natural tunnel of intermingled branches and leaves. Her eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror, which still reflected the fading image of the city skyline she had left behind. But as she entered Millersfield, the scenery underwent a metamorphosis. Green pastures unfurled like carpets, welcoming her into a world far removed from skyscrapers and traffic jams. Yet there was something uncanny. The sky, a shade too pastel, and the birdsong, a note too orchestrated, felt like a stage set up just for her arrival. The houses looked well kept, their yards immaculate, but they stood a little too far apart, as if each dwelling cherished its own secluded space. Millersfield was tight-knit, yet somehow distant, tranquil, yet simmering with an inexplicable tension. Residents passed by her car and offered smiles that felt like secrets. They were as much a part of this landscape as the land itself, woven into its fabric by threads of traditions and unspoken understandings. Sarah had taken the new teaching job at the community school partly to escape the hustle of city life, but mostly to escape a past that clung to her like a shadow. As she pulled into the driveway of her new home, a quaint, one-story affair with a wraparound porch, she sighed. She felt as if she had entered another era. For a moment, optimism filled her. Here, she could start anew. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the community hall for the Millersfield Welcome Gathering, an event apparently thrown in her honor. A banner displaying welcome to our newest neighbor adorned the back wall. Rows of foldable chairs were set up in front of a stage where Tom, the mayor, was making a passionate speech about community values. Community is family, and in Millersfield, we take care of our own, he said, locking eyes with Sarah briefly, an unspoken emphasis that sent a shiver down her spine. Her attention then shifted to Janet, the community historian. Janet was a slender woman in her 50s, clad in a flowery dress that made her almost blend into the floral wallpapers. She moved gracefully among the crowd, her eyes always observing, always assessing. She seemed like the kind of person who knew everyone's history but revealed little of her own. Standing near the exit was Reverend Morgan, dressed in a crisp black suit that seemed to absorb the room's light. His posture was rigid, as if he were a sentinel guarding a celestial gate. Sarah noticed that he had an unsettling habit. He touched his cross pendant every time someone mentioned the cornfield. Ah, the cornfield. Since her arrival, she couldn't ignore its almost magnetic presence. It stood on the edge of the town, miles upon miles of cornstalks swaying to a tune only they could hear. During the day, the sunlight seemed to be swallowed by its deep green expanse. At dusk, its outlines blurred, transforming into a shadowy realm where even the bravest souls feared to tread. As Tom concluded his speech, Sarah overheard snatches of hushed conversations among clusters of townspeople. "The harvest festival is next week," murmured one. "Yes, and thank God. My crop's been acting strange," whispered another. "And ought now," hissed a third, eyes darting in Sarah's direction as if she might catch their hidden meanings like a contagion. Odd, she thought. People here discussed the weather, the school, and even the local pie contest with boisterous enthusiasm. But mention the harvest festival, or worse, the cornfield, and the room would fill with an almost tactile silence. As the gathering dispersed, Tom approached her. "Sarah, I hope you'll join us for the harvest festival. It's a tradition here, one that ensures the well-being of Millersfield. In many ways, it's the soul of our community." "Thank you, Tom," she replied cautiously. "I'm still trying to learn the local customs, but I appreciate the invitation." "Learning is good," said Janet, joining the conversation with a cryptic smile. "But in Millersfield, some lessons are better left unlearned." Reverend Morgan, overhearing them, touched his cross pendant, his eyes narrowing. In God's eyes, ignorance is never bliss. And for the first time since her arrival, Sarah felt a ripple of unease stretch across the serene landscape of her new life. In that moment, Millersfield shifted from being just a community to becoming a puzzle. A puzzle that had its pieces missing, its edges frayed, and at its center lay a field of corn that seemed to hold secrets darker than the soil it grew from. Over the next week, Sarah eased into her new life in Millersfield. She organized her classroom, hiked along the well-trodden trails of the nearby woods, and even joined the local book club. Her colleagues at school were friendly, and her students showed an earnest desire to learn. Still, no matter how much she engaged, an invisible boundary seemed to separate her from the rest of the town. Like oil on water, she could mix but not melt. The Harvest Festival was the talk of the community. In the cafeteria, teachers shared festival anecdotes from years past. On Main Street, banners proclaiming Happy Harvest Festival danced in the autumn wind. Even the local supermarket was stocked with harvest-themed treats, a charming array of apple pies, cornbread, and specialty foods Sarah had never heard of. It was as if the town was putting on its finest garments for an annual ball. The Harvest Festival isn't just a celebration, Janet explained one afternoon when Sarah visited her home for tea. The walls were adorned with black and white photographs of Millersfield, its people, and surprisingly, multiple pictures of the cornfield in different seasons. It's a covenant between the land and us. You'll see what I mean. Sarah nodded, her eyes momentarily fixated on an old picture of what seemed like a ritual taking place in the cornfield. Men and women, their faces blurred with time, stood around a fire with arms lifted skyward. When she returned home, she found an envelope slipped under her front door. Unmarked, sealed but not stamped. Inside was a note that read, "Sarah, if you value your life, do not participate in the Harvest Festival's ceremony. Watch, but do not partake." A chill crawled up her spine. Her initial thought was to discard it as a prank, but the seriousness of the message haunted her. She locked her doors that night, for the first time feeling truly isolated in a town full of people. The day of the Harvest Festival arrived, tinged with a sense of gravity that seemed to weigh on the very air. Sarah wore a simple green dress, hoping to blend in yet stand apart. Her curiosity, blended with a dash of rebellion, had convinced her to attend. She was a spectator, she reminded herself, not a participant. The town square was transformed. Strings of yellow and orange lights adorned the trees, and stalls displaying handcrafted goods and food lined the perimeter. Children ran around laughing, adults mingled, and there was an undeniable atmosphere of jubilation. But under the laughter, the music, and the festivities was a quiet undercurrent of something Sarah couldn't identify. Reverence, perhaps, or maybe trepidation. As dusk fell, the crowd began to gravitate towards a large wooden platform that had been erected at one end of the square. Tom took the stage and raised his arms. "Neighbors, friends, it's time for the cornerstone of our Harvest Festival." Sarah watched as a group of men wheeled a large, veiled object onto the platform. When the cloth was removed, it revealed a lifelike statue of what appeared to be a deity, adorned with pieces of corn, stalks of wheat, and an assortment of fruits and vegetables. The townspeople began a chant, a rhythmic cadence that sounded more like an incantation than a hymn. One by one, they approached the statue and placed small tokens, lockets, handwritten notes, tiny vials of what looked like soil or water, into a large basin at its feet. The crowd's eyes turned expectantly towards Sarah. She felt the weight of their gaze, heavy with an anticipation she couldn't grasp. In that moment, she decided to remain where she was, silently refusing to partake in what had clearly turned from a mere festival into a ritual. Tom's eyes narrowed. Janet sighed as if a long-held dread had been realized. Reverend Morgan clutched his cross pendant so hard his knuckles turned white. Then something unnatural happened. The sky seemed to grow darker, as if offended. A gust of wind blew through the square, extinguishing the candles that adorned the platform. The cornfield, visible from the square, seemed to writhe as though agitated. The joyful veneer of the festival shattered, replaced by a palpable air of concern and subtle blame. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The anonymous letter flashed in her mind. She had crossed a line, torn a page from an unspoken rulebook. And from the furrows of the distant cornfield, she imagined she heard a low, guttural growl, as if the land itself were speaking and expressing its discontent. The days following the Harvest Festival were marked by an uneasy tension. Sarah couldn't shake the sense that the entire town was holding its collective breath. Gone were the friendly smiles from her neighbors. Her colleagues at the school started avoiding eye contact, and her students, who had been engaging and eager, became subdued. The cornfield, that sprawling expanse of green and gold that had once symbolized prosperity, became a field of decay almost overnight. The stalks were discolored, leaves drooping mournfully, and the cobs had taken on a sickly hue. Farmers stood at its edge, staring into the field with expressions of despair, but no one seemed willing to talk about it openly. It was as if speaking would confirm a terrible reality everyone was trying to ignore. And then there were the oddities around Sarah's home, freshly turned soil in her front yard as if someone had been digging, dead crows on her doorstep, and most disconcerting of all, faint whispers in the wind during the night, words she couldn't quite make out but filled her with dread nonetheless. In the midst of this mounting isolation, Janet approached Sarah, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and caution. "I think we should talk," she whispered, as they stood in the town's small library, surrounded by dusty volumes and faded newspapers. Sarah followed her to a secluded corner, where Janet carefully pulled out a series of old journals and ledgers. "The cornfield isn't just a field," she began hesitantly. "Our town's prosperity is intimately tied to something that resides there. I can't say more, but I thought you should know." Sarah's eyes widened as she flicked through the historical records. Every decade or so, a new family or individual would move into Millersfield, skeptics like her. And like clockwork, these entries would end in ellipses, disappearances, accidents, or unsolved mysteries. That night, as she pondered these unsettling revelations, a knock resounded on her front door. Opening it, she found Reverend Morgan, his face graver than she'd ever seen. "May I come in, Sarah?" he asked, his voice tinged with solemnity. "Of course," she replied, leading him to the living room, where the unopened envelope from an anonymous sender still lay on the coffee table. Reverend Morgan eyed it but said nothing. "I'm offering you a last chance, Sarah. A redemption ceremony, if you will. There's a balance, an ancient pact that keeps this town thriving. You've disrupted that balance, but there's still a way to set things right." Sarah felt a shiver snake its way down her spine. The air seemed to grow colder, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. "What does this ceremony entail?" she asked cautiously, her eyes locked onto the Reverend's. "It's a way to show your respect, your willingness to be a part of this community," he answered, avoiding her gaze. "But it must be your choice." Choice, Sarah thought. A choice that seemed to come with unspoken consequences, shrouded in secrecy. As Reverend Morgan left, she closed the door softly behind him and leaned against it, overwhelmed. The whispering wind, the decaying crops, the history of unexplained disappearances, all the enigmatic threads were converging, pointing her toward a terrifying tapestry of truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. But whether she wanted to or not, she knew she was already entangled. And the land, whatever resided in it, was watching, waiting for her next move. The late evening sky was tinged with murky shades of indigo and ash, casting a gloom over the small town of Millersfield. Sarah looked out from her window, her eyes scanning the sprawling, withering cornfield that loomed ominously in the distance. The notion of investigating that field was nothing short of madness, but she felt compelled to act. She couldn't shake off Reverend Morgan's words or the grim history Janet had hinted at. She had to know. Taking a flashlight and a small pocket knife for protection, Sarah stepped into the chilly night air, her feet leading her to the cornfield's edge. Each rustle of the wind through the dried leaves sent a shiver through her body, as if the field itself was whispering threats. Switching her flashlight on, she ventured into the labyrinthine maze of cornstalks. She began to notice strange symbols carved into some of the wooden posts that held up the scarecrows, unfamiliar glyphs that made her skin crawl with an instinctual dread. The deeper she went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and something far less identifiable, something unsettlingly feral. At last, she found it, an entrance obscured by dead foliage and darkness, leading into an underground lair. With every ounce of courage she could muster, Sarah descended. The dank atmosphere closed around her, smelling of mold, wet earth, and a coppery tang that reminded her unsettlingly of blood. Her flashlight revealed a horrifying tableau, bones and artifacts, and dark stains on the ground that left little to the imagination. They were remnants of rituals, tokens of sacrifices past. Her breath quickened, her hands trembling so violently that the beam of her flashlight danced like a firefly in the night. Then she heard it, the low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate from the very walls of the lair. She swung her flashlight around and gasped. The creature was grotesque, an abomination of scales, fur, and malevolent eyes that seemed to glow with an unholy light. But what struck her most was its presence. It emanated a raw, malevolent intelligence. "You don't belong here," it hissed, its voice a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Sarah felt her knees buckle, but she fought the urge to collapse. She was struck by a sudden realization. This creature was empowered by belief, by the town's ritualistic offerings and collective faith. Her skepticism, her refusal to partake in the harvest festival, had weakened it. "Your disbelief is like poison to me," it snarled, lunging forward. Adrenaline surging through her veins, Sarah scrambled back up the tunnel, her fear lending her a speed she never knew she had. She broke free into the night, the moon casting its pallid light over the decaying field, and didn't stop running until she was back inside her house, door bolted and windows locked. As she leaned against her front door, panting and teary-eyed, Sarah knew she had poked the proverbial beast. And the creature was not just hungry, it was angry. It had been weakened, yes, but it also had tasted her fear. Sarah also understood something else now. She had become the thread pulling at the seam of a community bound by a terrible secret, and things were about to unravel in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. The morning sun offered no comfort to Sarah as she pulled into the driveway of Janet's quaint colonial-style house. Dressed in a modest sweater and skirt, Janet greeted Sarah at the door with a cautious smile. The lines on her face seemed deeper today, her eyes burdened with a weight that went beyond years. "Sarah, come in," she said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Would you like some tea?" "Skip the pleasantries, Janet," Sarah said curtly. "We need to talk about what's really happening in this town." Janet sighed and led Sarah into the living room, filled with antiques and framed photographs that spanned generations. She gestured for her to sit. "I suppose it's time you knew everything," she began. "It's a risk, but maybe it's a risk worth taking." The room was enveloped in the rich aroma of aged wood and lavender. An old grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking time as Janet began her tale. "Our community," Janet said softly, "owes its existence to that creature. Centuries ago, the first settlers were on the brink of despair. Crops failed, diseases spread. It was an unlivable, cursed place, until they made a pact with the creature, a pact sealed in blood." Sarah's stomach churned at the grim implication. "Human sacrifices." "Yes," Janet admitted. "In return, our lands became fertile, our people healthy. The creature asked for one thing: to be acknowledged, to be believed in, and to be fed. So, every harvest festival, we offer it what it wants. If we don't, it has vowed to revert things back to how they were. And it has the power to do so, Sarah. The power to reduce this town to nothing." The air in the room grew stifling, heavy with the stench of an ugly truth laid bare. Sarah felt like she was drowning. "And you're okay with this? Living a lie? Killing people?" Janet's eyes watered, but she held her composure. "We do what we have to for the greater good. The alternative is unthinkable." Anger boiled within Sarah. The greater good is a facade built on fear and ignorance. Don't you see? By feeding it, you're giving it power over you. There's got to be another way. Fueled by her newfound knowledge and outrage, Sarah took her arguments to the town hall that evening. A crowd had gathered, murmurs filling the space as Sarah stood at the podium. Tom, the mayor, and Reverend Morgan sat nearby, their faces carved from stone. The chandeliers above cast warm glows on the wood-paneled walls, filling the room with an air of solemnity that contrasted sharply with the turmoil Sarah felt inside. "We've been slaves to a monster," she declared. "It's time we fought back." Skeptical eyes met her fervent gaze. A few people whispered among themselves, others looked away, but a small group, mostly younger folks, listened intently. They were the seeds of change, but could they grow fast enough? As the town hall meeting ended, Sarah felt the weight of an uncertain future bearing down on her. Not enough people were convinced, but it was a start. As she walked back to her car, her eyes caught movement at the edge of her vision. Just beyond the streetlight's halo, shapes moved through the darkness, slinking in the shadows that lay across the outskirts of the town. The creature was no longer content to stay in its lair. It was hungry, it was coming closer, and its eyes, those malevolent eyes, were fixed on Millersfield. But as Sarah looked towards the ominous stretch of wilderness that bordered the town, she felt a glimmer of something she had almost forgotten: hope. She knew she was no longer alone in her fight, and come what may, she was ready to face the darkness. The atmosphere in Millersfield was thick with tension, like a charged storm cloud ready to burst. Tom, the mayor, announced a special town meeting, dubbing it a second harvest festival. The underlying message was clear. The town was ready to cast judgment on Sarah, to decide her fate in the looming crisis. Sarah and her handful of allies spent the hours before the meeting in grim preparation. Under the cover of dusk, they laid their traps around the outskirts of the cornfield. Sarah had convinced them to use everything from industrial-grade pesticides to electrical snares. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt, their own private war against the unspeakable horror lurking in their midst. "You think this'll work?" asked Tim, one of the younger town members who had thrown his lot in with Sarah. His eyes were wide, reflecting both his inexperience and his willingness to defy tradition for the sake of what was right. "It has to," Sarah replied. The taste of desperation was bitter on her tongue, but it drove her forward. "Remember, it feeds on belief. Our disbelief is its poison. That and a good electrical shock, I hope." The town hall was bursting at the seams when Sarah walked in. Its colonial architecture, usually a comforting reminder of shared history, now felt like the bars of a prison. Tom was the first to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss the continued well-being of Millersfield, and the obstacle in that path." His eyes met Sarah's, cold and accusatory. Reverend Morgan took the stand next. "We all know the gravity of the choices before us tonight. The soul of our community hangs in the balance." Just as the Reverend prepared to continue, a guttural roar echoed from the direction of the cornfield. It sliced through the tension, drowning out even the beating of hearts. A powerful gust of wind burst through the hall's closed doors, extinguishing the lights. In the pitch darkness, the creature attacked. People screamed as they felt clawed limbs and gnashing teeth. The room was a labyrinth of terror, but Sarah's traps had prepared her for this. "This way," she yelled, pulling out a flashlight and directing its beam toward one of her traps, now armed and ready at the entrance of the hall. The creature lunged, its silhouette monstrous in the flashlight's glare. It fell into the snare, electrical currents surging through it. A deafening screech filled the air as it writhed, weakened but not defeated. Sarah took this moment to confront it, her voice tinged with a mixture of fear and resolve. "You have no power over me," she said, her words laced with disbelief and doubt aimed directly at the creature. Its roar diminished to a growl, then a whimper. It was shrinking, losing form, the collective disbelief of Sarah and her allies eroding its strength. With one final, agonized moan, it disintegrated into nothingness, leaving only an acrid smell of burnt soil and sulfur. The room's lights flickered back on, illuminating the shaken but alive faces of the townspeople. In the aftermath, Millersfield faced an uncertain future. The fertile lands began to revert, the community's health faltered, but so did the shackles of a horrifying tradition. It was a new beginning, one fraught with challenges yet free from the tyranny of the monstrous deity. As the town grappled with its new reality, Sarah pondered the cyclical nature of belief, sacrifice, and community. Millersfield had been unshackled from its dark past, but at a cost. A balance had been broken, but perhaps a new equilibrium would be found, one built on truth, however harsh, rather than sacrifices to an unspeakable horror. As she gazed out over the now withering cornfield, she felt the weight of her choices, but also the stirrings of a cautious optimism. In breaking the cycle, they had sown the seeds for a different kind of harvest, one not of fear and compliance, but of courage and change. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey through Millersfield and its dark secrets. We've come to the end, dear listeners, but the unsettling questions remain. What would you sacrifice for the greater good? And what happens when the seeds of disbelief are sown in a soil nurtured by blind faith and fear? Ponder these questions as you lay in bed tonight and listen. Listen closely, for the whispers in the wind might just be carrying secrets of their own. Until next time, sweet nightmares. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.